Coming up, a Telstra outage hits its shares, war uncertainty returns to the market, and we preview reporting season. All of that and more next. Hi everyone, welcome to the SBS On The Money podcast for this Wednesday, the 8th of July. It's a day where the Australian share market tumbled at the open, down around 1.5% as hostilities returned to the Middle East. However, it managed to slowly erase some of those losses, and by the close, the ASX 200 fell just 0.2%. Energy stocks did best by far on a rising oil price, which surged 5% compared with this time yesterday at about $76.50 US or Brent. Woodside shares up 3.2%, Santos nearly 6%. Telstra, though, fell to its lowest since February, down 3% at the close after it suffered a network outage, which it said late today is now fully resolved. Telstra is one of the country's most widely held stocks. It's in many super funds, and many Australians would have direct exposure going back to the T1 share offer when it was first floated back in 1997. For the details, I spoke with Ord Minnett investment analyst Francesco De Stradis. Francesco, the market's tumbled at the open, started to rise in the afternoon though. What's driving investor sentiment at the moment?
Oh, look, we had negative leads from the US overnight. And look, the geopolitical tensions that are on, particularly around the Middle East, are obviously making markets a little bit more volatile than normal. And that's been the case since the US invaded Iran. So I'm not expecting anything different there. We saw oil prices rise a bit overnight. So, things like inflation and interest rates are becoming a bit more of a focus again, particularly in the US. More locally, though, we tended to be following the lead at the moment. We're waiting for a movement into the reporting season. So I think we're through the confessions now. We've seen a few companies, a week or two ago, put out some warnings, but I think now it's everyone's sort of sitting on their hands waiting for reports.
All right, so let's break down everything you've just mentioned. With the war in the Middle East, does it mean that investors are not necessarily out of the woods yet when it comes to that? Because as you've mentioned, that oil price is back up and now we're talking about inflation concerns again.
Yeah, look, we're not out of the woods yet, definitely. The sensitivity around what's going on around the world is investors are focused on. So I think, as we see negotiations or conflict escalate or de-escalate, the markets will react. I remember a few weeks ago when the both parties got to the table, everyone thought, well, maybe this is it, and the markets rallied quite strongly. So I think the market's a little bit skittish, and that's really not going to play out until we see, I suppose, a full-blown agreement between the two countries. And that's going to take some time. I think once we do see that, we will see the markets rally a bit. Energy stocks will probably rally a bit too. But it's going to take some time for some of these companies to get back into full production as well. So I think there'll be a bit of a sentiment rally and then a bit of a reality check after that.
I think it'd be safe to say the corporate story of the day is that of Telstra and a huge outage in Australia in the morning. How did investors react to it, and what are the implications for the company?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, I think Telstra's share price has been fairly resilient. It's come off, and it's come off a bit because of the market as well as the outage they've seen this morning. Look, the outage, I think investors probably see this a bit more short term. Until we understand what the root cause was, is there any hacking involved in it or anything like that? I think investors are probably going to look through this as a one-day event rather than Telstra's systems are going to be out for a long period of time. That being said, we did see Optus come under a bit of pressure from an outage a few months ago now. And they were fined. I don't think Telstra will be at this stage. The fines for Optus came about because They didn't have procedures in place for emergency services and so on. And I don't know, but I don't think that Telstra is going to feel the brunt of that. So I think it's just a short-term thing. Look, some reputational damage will come about, but I think it's a big enough organisation to look through that, as long as it's not a systemic problem, though.
You mentioned reporting season earlier in that first answer. It really is around the corner, just a few weeks away. What will you be looking at?
Look, earnings expectations are relatively high for some of particularly the large cap stocks. So, and look, once we get through the confession season, most people tend to, know that the analysts are pretty close to the mark with their earnings expectations for this financial year just gone. I think what most brokers and investors are looking for is their FY27 outlook statements, and there'll be a couple of months of operations under their belt in the new financial year, so they'll give a bit of an update on how trading is going as well. So that'll become very interesting in the eyes of many analysts, and they'll have to either sharpen or blunt their pencils looking at the next year or two ahead. And that's where the investment community starts to become either optimistic or pessimistic around a company, depending on how their outlook statements align. And they'll be looking for outlook statements along the lines of where they think inflation's going to be. Labour costs are very important. So looking at how their margins are going to expand or contract. So they're the sort of things we'll be looking for. Opportunities will pop up occasionally as well, particularly when we start to see companies that have potentially been sold off from a downgrade maybe 6 months ago, start to support their numbers going forward, and maybe reinforce that there's no more downgrades, but maybe upgrades coming.
Finally, and in wrapping up, what are you telling your clients right now? Where do you see the opportunities for investors?
Well, as always at Ord Minnett, we're always telling investors to stay diversified, and particularly in an environment like this. I mentioned earlier that the geopolitical issues have made a little bit more volatile in the markets. So high quality investments and diversified portfolios always stand in good stead where times of volatility. Avoid chasing some of those momentum stocks as well that might have rallied significantly and got to very overvalued positions. If they're in your portfolio, you should be looking at them and maybe assessing whether you want to reduce your exposure to them, because there are some stocks out there in the marketplace that are very expensive, and if they miss their numbers on the reporting season, expect big sell-offs. But focusing on quality companies is what we're always looking for. Some of the themes that we're pushing out at the moment is, and I might have mentioned this to you in the past, Ricardo, AI is always a theme for the future. I think data centers have probably been, maybe that's the low-hanging fruit, which all the good gains have already been done. But I think investors need to start looking at other areas where AI is challenging investors. And that comes down to things like cybersecurity. I think the investment in cybersecurity has to grow as AI increases, and also processing speed. I think there's a lot of investment that needs to be made in increasing not only the speed of processing, but being more efficient in the use of energy and processing power. And that comes down to things like copper as well. So there's a couple of themes that we're looking at Ord Minnett going forward.
That's awesome. And for my benefit, mate, back in the day, right, back in the Sky News. That's Francesco De Stradis there from Ord Minnett, and he wraps up the podcast for this. What day is it today? It's Wednesday. Give it a like, a review, and subscribe if you enjoyed. And don't forget, you can watch On the Money during the 6:30 weekday edition of SBS World News on SBS. Podcast returns tomorrow. It drops after the market close, and I'll catch you then. This SBS On the Money podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be understood as constituting advice or a recommendation. It is not personal advice, and it does not consider your personal circumstances or objectives. You should contact a licensed professional before making any financial decisions.